I knew trouble was coming the second I saw Karren Middleton stomping up my driveway, clipboard in hand, her mouth already twisted into that signature disapproving scowl. The woman had made it her life's mission to harass everyone in the neighborhood, but today, I could tell this was personal. I barely had time to set down my coffee before she was jabbing a manicured finger at my front lawn. "Landon Isley, this is completely unacceptable," she snapped, her tone dripping with faux authority. "Your grass is an absolute disgrace. Dead patches everywhere. You are single-handedly bringing down the property values of this entire community." I glanced at my yard. Yeah, it wasn't exactly pristine, but it wasn't my fault. We'd had an unusually brutal summer, and the city had imposed strict water restrictions. I wasn't about to waste what little water we had keeping my lawn perfectly green just to appease Karren and her band of HOA tyrants. I crossed my arms. "Karren, the whole neighborhood is struggling with their lawns. The heat's been insane, and we're all dealing with the water restrictions." She scoffed. "That's no excuse. Other homeowners have found ways to keep their lawns presentable. Maybe if you prioritized your responsibilities, you wouldn't be in this situation." I bit back a laugh. "My responsibilities? Karren, I work 60-hour weeks. I have actual priorities, and making sure my grass is up to your ridiculous standards isn't one of them." Her eyes narrowed. "Well, I hope you're prepared for the consequences of your neglect. The HOA is issuing you a formal citation. You have 7 days to restore your lawn, or we'll be imposing a daily fine of $200 until it's fixed." I shook my head, exhaling sharply. "You're out of your mind." Karren smiled one of those smug, self-satisfied grins that made my blood boil. "Rules are rules, Landon. You agreed to abide by them when you moved here. If you refuse to comply, I will have no choice but to escalate this matter." I didn't bother arguing further. Karren wasn't interested in fairness or logic. She thrived on control, and this was just another power trip. What I didn't realize at the time, though, was just how far she was willing to take it. 3 days later, I received a lawsuit. Karren Middleton, acting on behalf of the HOA, was suing me for violating community standards, claiming my lawn was an eyesore that diminished the value of neighboring properties. She was demanding thousands in fines and even threatening forced compliance, which meant they could hire landscapers at my expense. I couldn't believe it, a lawsuit over some dead grass. I tossed the papers onto my kitchen table, rubbing my temples. My wife, Bianca, walked in just as I let out a frustrated sigh. She raised an eyebrow. "What now?" I slid the lawsuit across the table. She skimmed through it, her expression darkening with each line. "Are you kidding me? She actually filed a lawsuit over this." "Yep, looks like Karren's really out for blood this time," I muttered, pouring myself another cup of coffee. We knew she was bad, but this is next-level insanity. Bianca tapped her fingers against the table, deep in thought, and then, slowly, a grin spread across her face. I frowned. "What?" She looked up at me, eyes sparkling with something between amusement and satisfaction. "Landon, do you realize who's assigned to preside over small claims cases this month?" It took me a second, but then it hit me. My wife, my wonderful, brilliant wife, was married to Judge Elias Isley. My brother. And Elias had zero patience for HOA nonsense. I let out a short laugh, shaking my head. "You have got to be kidding me." Bianca grinned. "Oh, this is going to be glorious." I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the lawsuit papers while Bianca scrolled through her phone, searching for the court docket. A few moments later, she let out a satisfied hum and turned the screen toward me. There it was, Elias's name listed as the judge presiding over small claims cases for the next 2 months. I exhaled, shaking my head. It was almost too perfect. Karren had no idea what she had just walked into. Bianca tapped a finger against the table, thinking, We could just let this play out naturally, she said. Elias isn't the type to play favorites, but he's also not the type to tolerate nonsense. If Karren thinks she can bully you with legal threats, she's about to learn a very painful lesson. I leaned back in my chair, considering my options. Could fight this lawsuit the traditional way, hire an attorney, spend weeks going back and forth over court filings, and waste a ridiculous amount of time proving that my lawn wasn't some catastrophic blight on the neighborhood. Or I could sit back and let Karren march herself straight into a courtroom where my brother, who had spent years shutting down frivolous HOA cases, would be waiting. The choice was obvious. Bianca must have seen something in my expression because she grinned. "You're going to enjoy this, aren't you?" I chuckled, "Oh, immensely." The next few days passed without any further visits from Karren, which was unusual. Normally, she would have been circling my property like a vulture, looking for any excuse to issue another citation. But I suspected she was too busy preparing for court, probably convinced she was about to make some grand example out of me. She had no idea what was coming. When the court date finally arrived, I dressed in a simple button-down and slacks, nothing flashy, just enough to look presentable. Bianca accompanied me, though she planned to sit in the gallery. Neither of us had informed Elias about the case beforehand. He would see it on the docket soon enough, and I wanted to watch the exact moment he realized who was standing before him. As we entered the courtroom, I spotted Karren immediately. She was sitting at the plaintiff's table, dressed in an outfit that screamed self-importance, a stiff blazer, pearls, and an expression that could curdle milk. She glanced up as I walked past, lips curling in smug satisfaction, as if she had already won. I took my seat at the defense table and waited. A few moments later, the bailiff called the session to order, and the door at the back of the courtroom opened. Judge Landon Isley stepped in, robes flowing as he took his place behind the bench. He glanced down at the docket, flipping through the pages, and then his eyes landed on my name. There was a brief pause. Then slowly he looked up, locking eyes with me. I gave him a small, polite nod. Elias's lips pressed together, and for the briefest moment, I saw the corners twitch an almost imperceptible sign of amusement. He exhaled through his nose, then turned his attention to Karren. "Plaintiff, please state your name and the nature of your complaint," Elias said, his tone neutral. Karren straightened her posture. "Your Honor, my name is Karren Middleton, and I am the president of the Oakwood Estates Homeowners Association. Have filed suit against the defendant, Landon Isley, for repeated violations of our community's landscaping standards, which have negatively impacted property values and the overall appearance of our neighborhood." Elias nodded, flipping through the case file. "And these violations specifically pertain to his lawn?" "Yes, Your Honor," Karren said, her voice firm. "Mr. Isley has allowed his front yard to deteriorate into an unacceptable state. His grass is patchy, discolored, and in clear violation of our HOA's landscaping guidelines." Elias looked at me. "Mr. Isley, how do you respond to these allegations?" I folded my hands in front of me. "Your Honor, the city has implemented strict water restrictions due to an ongoing drought. Have complied with those restrictions, which has naturally affected the health of my lawn. Additionally, several other homes in the neighborhood have similar conditions, yet I am the only one being sued." Elias turned back to Karren. "Is the defendant correct? Have other homeowners faced similar issues?" Karren's lips thinned. "Perhaps, but Mr. Isley's property is particularly egregious." Elias held up a hand. "I'll be the judge of that." He flipped through the evidence. Karren had submitted photos of my lawn, taken at unflattering angles, likely edited to make the situation look worse than it was. He studied them for a moment, then set them aside. "Ms. Middleton, does the HOA have an exemption for extreme weather conditions?" Elias asked. Karren hesitated. Our guidelines state that homeowners must maintain their lawns to an acceptable standard. That's not what I asked, Elias said, his voice taking on a sharper edge. Does the HOA have an exemption for extreme weather conditions? Karren shifted in her chair. No, Your Honor. Elias nodded, then turned to me. Mr. Isley, have you made any attempts to improve your lawn despite the city's water restrictions? I reached into my folder and pulled out receipts. Yes, Your Honor. I've used drought-resistant fertilizer, aerated the soil, and even looked into installing a drought-friendly landscaping alternative, but the HOA rejected my request. Elias raised an eyebrow. They rejected your request to replace your lawn with drought-friendly landscaping. I nodded. Correct. They stated that all front yards must have traditional grass despite the water restrictions. Elias turned back to Karren. Ms. Middleton, do you have a justification for denying the defendant's request? Karren's expression tightened. It would disrupt the uniformity of the neighborhood. Elias leaned back in his chair, exhaling through his nose. So, let me get this straight. The HOA is requiring homeowners to maintain their lawns, despite city-imposed water restrictions. They have denied reasonable alternatives that would comply with both HOA guidelines and environmental concerns. And now, you are suing this homeowner for failing to achieve something that is, by your own policies, impossible. There was a long, painful silence. Karren's jaw clenched. We have a responsibility to uphold the standards of our community. Elias cut her off. Ms. Middleton, what you have is a lawsuit that is entirely without merit. Karren's face paled. Elias picked up his gavel. This case is dismissed. The HOA is ordered to cease all fines and legal action against the defendant immediately. The gavel came down with a sharp crack. Karren sat there, stunned, her mouth opening and closing like a fish. I stood up, nodded to Elias, and walked out of the courtroom with Bianca by my side. As we stepped into the hallway, Bianca let out a low whistle. That was satisfying. I grinned. Oh, you have no idea. Karren had tried to make an example out of me. Instead, she had just handed me the easiest victory of my life on a silver platter. As we walked out of the courthouse, the weight of the absurd lawsuit finally lifted off my shoulders. Bianca, still grinning from ear to ear, nudged me playfully. Her amusement was palpable, and I couldn't blame her. Karren had walked into that courtroom expecting a victory, only to be handed a humiliating defeat in front of a judge who had no tolerance for her nonsense. I glanced at my wife. So, what do you think Karren's next move is? Bianca exhaled, considering. She won't take this lying down. People like her don't know how to accept a loss. If anything, she's probably already plotting her next attempt at making your life miserable. She was right. Karren wasn't the type to admit defeat gracefully. As we drove back home, I mulled over what her next move might be. I didn't have to wait long to find out. The very next morning, I stepped outside to grab the newspaper and spotted a notice taped to my front door. My stomach clenched as I pulled it off and read the bold lettering at the top. Urgent violation, Notice Oakwood Estates HOA. I exhaled sharply, already feeling my blood pressure rise. Bianca, who had just stepped onto the porch with her coffee, arched an eyebrow as I handed her the notice. Her lips parted slightly as she scanned the paper. Unbelievable, she's doubling down. According to the notice, my property was now under an official review for multiple violations, including excessive yard neglect, improper maintenance of exterior structures, and failure to comply with aesthetic standards. I let out a dry laugh. Exterior structures, what does that even mean? Bianca rolled her eyes. She's throwing everything at the wall to see what sticks. It was clear that Karren wasn't going to back off just because she lost in court. She was trying a different tactic, burying me in bogus violations to make my life miserable. I wasn't about to let that happen. I pulled out my phone and started snapping pictures of my property. If Karren was going to fabricate violations, I was going to document every inch of my home and yard to prove her wrong. Bianca sipped her coffee, watching me. "What's your plan?" I glanced at her. "First, I'm going to gather evidence. Then, I'm going to find out if she's targeting anyone else. If she's abusing her power against me, she's probably doing it to others too." Bianca nodded approvingly. "I like where this is going." Over the next day, I made it my mission to talk to as many neighbors as possible. As it turned out, I wasn't the only one receiving ridiculous violation notices. Tom, the retired firefighter down the street, had been cited for excessively large trash bins, despite using the standard city-issued ones. Maria, a single mother, had been fined for improperly parked vehicles, even though her car was parked perfectly within her own driveway. Even old Mr. Peterson, who had lived in the neighborhood for 30 years, had somehow received a violation for failure to maintain a consistent paint color on his mailbox. This wasn't just about me. Karren was waging a campaign against anyone she personally disliked or saw as a threat to her control. That gave me an idea. I gathered everyone who had received questionable violations and invited them to my backyard for a meeting. The frustration was evident on all their faces as they shared their experiences. Some had been dealing with Karren's tyranny for years, paying fines just to avoid the headache of fighting back. That was about to change. I laid out my plan documenting each bogus violation, collecting testimonies, and filing an official complaint with the city's housing authority. If Karren wanted to play dirty, we were going to hit back with facts, legal filings, and community support. Maria crossed her arms. "Do you really think this will work?" I nodded. "If we present enough evidence, the city will have no choice but to investigate. And if they find she's abusing her authority, the HOA could face serious consequences." Tom's expression hardened. It's about time someone put her in her place. With a plan in motion, I spent the next few days compiling everything we needed. I drafted a formal complaint, attached every piece of evidence, and submitted it to the city. Now we just had to wait. Karren had no idea that while she was busy trying to make my life miserable, she had inadvertently united the entire neighborhood against her. And soon enough, she was going to realize just how big of a mistake she had made. The waiting game didn't take long. 3 days after submitting the formal complaint, a letter from the city's housing authority arrived in my mailbox. It was short, and to the point, an official investigation into the Oakwood Estates HOA had been opened. The letter requested that I, along with any other affected homeowners, be available for interviews and provide any additional documentation we had. I showed the letter to Bianca, who scanned it quickly before setting it on the kitchen counter with an approving nod. The wheels were in motion, and Karren had no idea what was about to hit her. By the time the city investigators arrived, word had spread through the neighborhood. Several homeowners had stepped forward with their own grievances, some dating back years. It was a mess of fabricated fines, selective enforcement, and outright harassment. The investigators took their time, speaking with everyone who had been affected, reviewing our compiled evidence, and taking detailed notes. I knew Karren would catch wind of this soon, and I wasn't disappointed. That evening, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, she stormed up my driveway again, this time without her usual smug demeanor. Her expression was tight with barely concealed fury, and she clutched a stack of papers as if they were a weapon. She didn't bother with pleasantries. Instead, she thrust the papers toward me, her voice strained with anger. "You had no right to involve the city," she hissed. Took the papers from her hands, flipping through them. A formal cease and desist letter from the HOA, demanding that I withdraw my complaint or face further consequences. Bianca, who had just stepped onto the porch, leaned against the doorframe and crossed her arms. Her presence alone was enough to unnerve Karren, but my wife's calm, assessing gaze made it even worse. I glanced back at Karren, unimpressed. "You're threatening me with further consequences after already trying to sue me over my lawn? What's left, eggs?" Her lips pressed into a thin line. "You don't understand what you've done. This investigation could destroy our HOA's credibility. If the city finds any violations, they could strip us of our authority." I shrugged. "Then maybe you should have thought about that before abusing your power." Her face flushed with anger, but before she could throw another empty threat my way, Bianca spoke up. "You seem awfully concerned about losing control, Karren. Makes me wonder what you're really afraid of." Karren shot Bianca a sharp glare but didn't respond. That silence told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't just about a power trip, she had something to lose. She turned on her heel and marched away without another word. The next morning, the city investigators returned, this time with a new focus. They weren't just looking at the violations Karren had issued, they were digging into the HOA's financial records. That was when things really started unraveling. One of the investigators, a sharp-eyed woman named Jessica, pulled me aside after interviewing several residents. She had a clipboard filled with notes, and her expression was grim. "There's something off about the way your HOA has been handling fines and fees," she said. "Several homeowners reported paying fines in cash with no receipts provided. Others mentioned sudden increases in HOA dues with no clear explanation as to where the money was going." That set off alarm bells in my head. If Karren and her board were collecting money under the table, that was a whole new level of corruption. I told Jessica I'd ask around, and by the end of the day, I had confirmed what she suspected. Multiple neighbors had made cash payments directly to Karren or one of her board members, only to find that their fines were still listed as unpaid in the HOA records. The next step was obvious. Jessica and her team filed an official request for the HOA's financial records. Legally, Karren had no choice but to comply. When the city's auditors finally got their hands on the documents, the truth came crashing down. Tens of thousands of dollars were unaccounted for. The HOA had been collecting fines and dues, but a significant portion of the money had never been deposited into the association's official accounts. Instead, the records showed bizarre inconsistencies, withdrawals with no explanation, inflated maintenance costs that didn't match actual work done, and payments to consultants who didn't exist. Karren had been running a racket. By the time the city announced their findings, the entire neighborhood was buzzing with the news. Karren and her inner circle had been embezzling funds from the HOA for years, masking their theft by issuing bogus fines and increasing dues whenever they needed more money. The fallout was immediate and brutal. The city issued a cease and desist order against the HOA, freezing all financial assets until a full audit could be completed. Homeowners who had been fined unfairly were instructed to file claims to recover their money. And Karren. She was removed from her position as HOA president, effective immediately. But that wasn't the worst of it for her. The city forwarded their findings to law enforcement, and within a week, Karren found herself facing charges for fraud and embezzlement. The last time I saw her, she was being escorted out of her house by 2 officers, her face pale and stunned as the reality of her situation sank in. The neighborhood, once divided by her reign of terror, came together in celebration. There was a sense of relief, of justice finally being served. People who had been afraid to speak up before now openly shared their stories, and for the first time in years, Oakwood Estates felt like a community again. As for me, I stood on my newly landscaped front lawn approved by the city, drought-resistant, and completely out of the HOA's control, and enjoyed the peaceful silence. Karren had tried to ruin me over a patch of dry grass. Instead, she had dug her own grave. With Karren removed from power and facing criminal charges, the neighborhood finally had a chance to breathe. For the first time in years, people no longer feared receiving fabricated fines or being harassed over minor infractions. The relief was almost tangible. Families gathered in front yards without worrying about HOA spies jotting down violations, and neighbors who had barely spoken before bonded over their shared victory. But the HOA wasn't dead yet. Karren's sudden downfall left a power vacuum, and the board members who hadn't been implicated in the fraud scrambled to maintain control. A few of them, namely, her most loyal supporters, tried to downplay the entire situation, insisting that the association just needed better management instead of a complete overhaul. That wasn't going to fly. Tom, Maria, and I had been keeping close tabs on the unfolding events, and we knew that if we didn't act fast, another Karren in the making could rise from the ashes. So, we gathered the community once again, this time to discuss what came next. The meeting took place in my backyard, where the air buzzed with excitement and determination. People weren't just angry about the corruption, they were ready to take action. Tom, ever the straight shooter, laid it out bluntly. The HOA had lost the trust of the homeowners, and continuing under its current leadership was not an option. Maria added that while some form of community organization could be beneficial, it had to be transparent and fair, not the dictatorship they had suffered under Karren. The solution was clear. We needed an entirely new board, one that represented the will of the residents rather than a handful of power-hungry individuals. But dismantling the existing structure wouldn't be easy. HOA bylaws were tricky things, often designed to protect those in power. Karren and her inner circle had made sure of that. Even with her gone, the remaining board members still had authority, and they weren't about to give it up willingly. That's where Bianca came in. My wife had spent the past few days poring over every legal document tied to the HOA, and she'd found a loophole, one that Karren had likely never considered because she never thought she'd lose control. The bylaws allowed for a special vote of no confidence if a petition signed by more than 60% of homeowners was submitted. If successful, it would force an immediate dissolution of the board, triggering a full re-election process. It was the perfect opportunity to wipe the slate clean. With a clear goal in mind, we set to work. Over the next week, we went door to door, explaining the situation and gathering signatures. The response was overwhelming. People who had once been indifferent to HOA politics eagerly signed, eager to ensure that no one like Karren would ever hold power again. When we finally submitted the petition, the remaining board members were visibly shaken. They tried to stall, claiming they needed time to review the legitimacy of the signatures, but the bylaws were clear. A vote had to be held within 2 weeks. That night, Bianca and I sat on the porch, watching the neighborhood come alive in a way it hadn't in years. Kids played freely, people laughed, and a sense of camaraderie filled the air. It was exactly what a community was supposed to feel like. 2 weeks later, the vote took place. The board members tried to rally their supporters, but they were vastly outnumbered. When the final count was announced, it wasn't even close. The motion to dissolve the board passed with an overwhelming majority. For the first time in Oakwood Estates history, the HOA was completely dismantled. A new election was held, and this time, the candidates were people the community trusted, residents who had been on the receiving end of Karren's tyranny and wanted to ensure it never happened again. By the time everything was finalized, Oakwood Estates was a different place. The new HOA focused on actual community needs rather than arbitrary punishments. Unreasonable fines were eliminated, and new policies were put in place to prevent any future abuse of power. As for Karren, her legal troubles only worsened. The embezzlement charges stuck, and with the additional evidence uncovered during the investigation, she faced a lengthy court battle. The last I heard, she was trying to negotiate a plea deal. Standing on my porch that evening, Bianca beside me, I took in the peaceful sight of our neighborhood, the same neighborhood Karren had tried to control through fear and manipulation. She had tried to ruin me over a dying lawn. Instead, she had lost everything. The weeks following the HOA's collapse were a whirlwind of change. Without Karren and her enforcers looming over everyone, Oakwood Estates began to flourish in ways no one had expected. Where once there had been a neighborhood ruled by arbitrary fines and oppressive rules, now there was a true sense of community. Yards that had suffered under the cruel landscaping restrictions found new life as homeowners embraced drought-resistant plants and creative gardening solutions. Driveways that had once been monitored for the slightest perceived infraction now held gatherings as neighbors reconnected, free from the constant threat of citations. The fear that had gripped the community for years had vanished, replaced by a collective relief that was almost palpable. Bianca and I had settled into a peaceful routine, enjoying the newfound quiet Karren's absence had brought. But even with her gone, there was still unfinished business. The legal case against her was progressing, and rumors swirled about just how deep her corruption had gone. One evening, as I was grilling in the backyard, Tom stopped by, his expression one of quiet amusement. He handed me a folded newspaper, and as I glanced at the front page, I let out a low whistle. The headline read, "Former HOA President Faces Additional Charges. Fraud Investigation Expands." The article detailed how investigators had uncovered more than just financial mismanagement. Beyond the missing funds, there were reports of fabricated maintenance costs, fake vendor contracts, and even illegal kickbacks. Karren hadn't just been running a scam, she had built an entire web of deceit, using the HOA as her personal piggy bank. It was worse than any of us had suspected. Bianca joined us, scanning the article before shaking her head. The sheer audacity of Karren's actions was staggering, but what struck me most was how oblivious she had been to the consequences. She had assumed her position was untouchable, that no one would ever challenge her authority. That delusion had been her downfall. As the trial date approached, the neighborhood buzzed with anticipation. Many of us planned to attend, not just for the spectacle, but for closure. Karren had spent years terrorizing homeowners, and now she would finally have to answer for it in a court of law. The day of the trial, Bianca and I arrived early, taking seats near the front. The courtroom was packed with familiar faces. Tom, Maria, and dozens of other residents filled the benches, their expressions ranging from satisfaction to outright curiosity. Then Karren walked in. She looked nothing like the confident, domineering woman who had once ruled Oakwood Estates. Her normally pristine appearance was disheveled, her movements stiff with tension. She avoided eye contact, her gaze fixed straight ahead as she took her seat at the defendant's table. Her attorney, a sharp-looking man in a crisp suit, leaned over to whisper something to her, but she barely acknowledged him. The weight of what was happening had finally sunk in. When the judge entered, the room fell silent. This time, it wasn't Elias presiding, but a no-nonsense judge known for her firm hand in fraud cases. The proceedings began swiftly, with the prosecution laying out its case in meticulous detail. The evidence was overwhelming. Bank statements, falsified invoices, and testimony from former board members painted a damning picture of Karren's greed. Witness after witness took the stand, each adding another nail to her coffin. Homeowners recounted years of unjust fines, missing payments, and intimidation tactics. Even former allies of Karren distanced themselves, eager to avoid being implicated in her schemes. When it was time for Karren to testify, she hesitated. Her attorney advised against it, but she insisted, perhaps believing she could talk her way out of the mess she had created. But the moment she spoke, it became clear she was out of her depth. She tried to paint herself as a misunderstood leader, claiming she had only ever acted in the best interest of the community. But under cross-examination, her carefully constructed facade crumbled. The prosecutor presented document after document disproving her claims, each one chipping away at her credibility. Karren grew flustered, her responses becoming more defensive and erratic. By the time the prosecutor was finished, it was evident to everyone in the room there was no way out for her. The trial lasted several days, but the verdict was inevitable. Guilty. The sentence was harsh but deserved. Karren was ordered to pay restitution to the homeowners she had wronged, her personal assets seized to cover the damages. Additionally, she faced several years of prison time for fraud and embezzlement. The courtroom erupted into whispers as the judge delivered the final ruling, and for the first time, Karren looked truly defeated. She didn't lash out, didn't argue, she simply stared ahead, as if finally realizing just how far she had fallen. As she was led away in handcuffs, the weight of her downfall settled over the room. Outside the courthouse, the atmosphere was one of cathartic relief. Homeowners embraced, laughter and conversation filling the air. The reign of terror was over, and justice had been served. Tom clapped me on the back, a grin spreading across his face. Maria shook her head, still in disbelief at how everything had unfolded. Bianca looped her arm through mine, smiling as she looked around at the joyous faces. It was over. Karren had tried to break me over a patch of dry grass, thinking she was invincible. Instead, she had lost everything. And Oakwood Estates was finally free.